Welcome. My name is Anna-Rita Pergolizzi-Wentworth, and today's talk will be on multilingualism, or the learning or knowing of more than one language. I'm extremely passionate about the topic for multiple reasons, personally, but also professionally. I've dedicated my career to bilingual and trilingual programs. So the secret is out. Multilingualism is a good thing. Prior to some of the technology that now we can use, there was some confusion as to whether or not it was a good thing, so to speak. But now, because of the advancements in brain imaging particularly, such as non-invasive brain imaging of children, we know that certain aspects of the brain get tapped into that would otherwise lay dormant in the multilingual/monolingual brain situation. So here you actually see a slide of the activity in a multilingual brain versus that of a monolingual brain. And the area that gets the most affected, if you will, is the parietal lobe. And why that's important, and why it's important to understand that other areas also are getting tapped into, is because in the long term, it's almost as though the building of these reserves will come into play as a child's life unfolds into adulthood. And we'll actually talk about that a bit more later on in the presentation. So another area that technology has shown us that there are positive gains, if you will, for the brain is in plasticity. To understand plasticity within the context of multilingualism, it's important to actually take a step back and just understand plasticity on a whole. Plasticity involves neurons or nerve cells that transmit impulses. And this constant transmission, if you will, creates neurological pathways in the brain. And so what happens when an infant is born is that they have 100 billion neurons that they come to us with. That's actually a lot. That's a lot. If they were to keep all of that in their brain, it would be cluttered to a certain degree. So they go through this natural process, which is called pruning, which is basically trimming away any of the unused or unneeded neurons. So that's very important, right? If you don't need it, it's fine that we get rid of it. But the unused ones, that to a parent or to an educator is important, because it essentially indicates to us that we have power to essentially wire our children's brains. An example of that, so to speak, is in a research study that recently was conducted in the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences in Washington. And so what they found was that children, when they're born, because of how many neurons they are born with, they can distinguish 800 of the world's sounds. So 800 happens to be the number of all the sounds of the world's languages combined. Each language has roughly 40 sounds or phonemes, okay? So what they found is that when these children are born through this technology that's, again, non-invasive, they find that over the course of time, they'll become specialized in their native language. So they'll trim away essentially some of these neurons, you will, and they'll become incredibly familiar with their 40 sounds that they continuously hear. However, when they conduct this study with bilinguals, they have a subset of 80 sounds. Trilinguals, those exposed to 3 languages, 120 sounds. So you could see how plasticity in this case plays a huge role in multilingualism. It's important because the greater the foundation of sounds that you give, later on in the future, if you want your child to pursue an additional language, they already have that foundational layer, if you will. But it's not only gains in the languages that they're learning, but in language development on the whole. Okay. The other effects, positive effects that we have learned about through technology is in executive function skills. Executive function skills are essentially our cognitive control center. So how we process information, how we absorb it, how we make sense of information in our brain so that we can then output it in expressive language. It's our ability to sustain attention, to foster independence, all of those good things, if you will, that a learner needs for future learning, okay? So what happens in a multilingual context is that children who are exposed to more than one language from birth, or even within this 0 to 6 window, they're constantly making sense of the languages within their brains. So it inherently fosters executive function skills, because as they get older, they're saying to this house, do I speak to you in this language? Do I speak to you in the other language? That process of going back and forth essentially creates these grooves, if you will, or fine-tunes these skills more and more every single time. There's also long-term effects, which I think this part's fascinating. The long-term effects are that multilingualism has been proven to delay the onset of certain neurological disorders such as Alzheimer's and dementia. What they have found is that for every language that someone knows, it could potentially delay it 4 years. So 2 additional languages could be 8 years. It's basically kicking a can down a road, for something that obviously, as we all know, is hereditary, but it's not saying that it'll stop it, but it can certainly help someone who may get it. Another area in which they have found positive effects is in stroke victims. There have been these studies when you compare multilinguals to monolinguals who have had strokes. They find that those who are multilingual can bounce back very quickly and can almost regain lots of their cognitive function to what it had been prior to the stroke. To think about it in that way is quite enlightening. You're building reserves when you're learning an additional language. And so if something like that in the future does happen to you, like a stroke or some sort of neurological disorder, you're essentially able to tap into those reserves for anything like that. With technology, the world is becoming a much more interconnected place. So there's many more opportunities for cross-cultural exchanges in a way that in our generations may not have even existed. And so for our children to have that skill set of knowing an entire, another way of communicating with the world, it's a gift, really. It also develops their empathy, because in knowing the idiosyncrasies or the features of a language, it gives you insight into a culture that you may not attain if you didn't know the language of that particular culture. Another language is almost as though you get to put another pair of glasses on to see the world, because you're truly getting to see the other in a way that you may not have been able to without that. But there's still something holding us, perhaps as a society, back from taking a leap into the world of multilingualism in our homes and in our schools. So what I'll walk you through right now are some of those myths and some of those questions that we have perhaps as parents and as educators that may be doing that. So one of them was children get confused, right? We know now that all children can certainly learn multiple languages. In fact, when they're learning more than one language and they're making sense of those 2 or 3, however many languages within their brain, it goes back to that executive function piece that I had touched upon earlier. It helps them not only in being able to communicate with more than one individual or cultures, whatever the case may be, but it helps them in other areas such as concentration, attention, stamina, etc. Parents should speak the school's language at home. Parents often think that, if I speak to my child in a language that's not spoken to him or her in school, in this instance it would be English, am I preparing my child for what's to come when they enter an English environment? Are they going to be able to keep on point, so to speak, or with his or her counterparts? The playground is a scary place sometimes. And when my own boy was roughly 2 years old, I recall thinking to myself, we're speaking to him in Spanish and English, and I heard all the little boys and little girls conversing in English, and I thought to myself, will I be holding him back potentially in a certain way? It's a natural feeling that we sometimes get as parents, but that certainly does not happen. You should definitely speak to your child in the language that you feel comfortable speaking to him or her in. Doing this is going to support them in so many more ways in the long run. Just knowing and believing in that research, and maybe even encountering some friends that have done it before, and you'll see that they can certainly handle more than one language. Bilingualism causes delays in young children. So I sort of touched upon that before with the playground example. We know that that certainly is not the case. In fact, there have been studies that knowing more than one language also supports certain areas like mathematics or just English grammar and conventions to begin with. So there's, for example, learners of Mandarin, it taps into an area of the brain, the temporal lobe, and the temporal lobe is what you use for mathematics. That's just that one example of the many that exist out there. So how to get started? This is another one that holds some families and some schools back. There's not really a sense of, okay, where do I can even begin? Okay, and that's actually what I'm going to hopefully help with today by providing you with some takeaway tips for this. So the first thing that I often recommend to families is that you have to know who you are linguistically. So essentially taking a self-assessment of yourself. What languages are there, in the home, or what languages do you have access to outside of the home, or what friendships, whatever the case may be. Once you know who you are linguistically, thinking to yourself, what are our goals for our children or child in this case? Do we want them to be proficient in another language? Do we want them to be biliterate in another language? Does it really not matter, which is fine too, but the point is you have to know who you are and where you want to go. Every family is going to have a different language profile, and every family is going to have different goals. And so the course of action, its intensity, if you will differ according to what you've decided upon and who you are. But generally speaking, in all instances, the sooner the better. The 0 to 6 brain is incredibly malleable. From 0 to 3, the absorption rate, so to speak, for sounds is highly tuned. From 3 to 6, although that window closes just a bit, from 3 to 6, you'll find that children aren't afraid to make mistakes. And so that's why they'll often say that in terms of second language acquisition, that 0 to 6 window is really a magical time. Recognizing the opportunities. I've met so many families that will tell me, I'm actually from Turkey, where they do have the access and they do have the opportunities, but perhaps because of myths or just fear of the unknown, they really don't know how to navigate that piece. And so my recommendation is, if you see it there, try as a family to figure out how you can use it. Being realistic. When you decide what your goals are, when you decide realistically, right, what you have access to, picking a course of action that you're going to be able to sustain. Because how many of us, not just in languages, but just in general as parents, right, we say, we're going to do this, and then we don't sometimes follow through, and that's actually more detrimental, so to speak. So the same thing with languages. If you pick something, try to do something that you're going to be able to do every single day, day in and day out. Staying the course, right, and not falling into those myths, as hard as it's going to be, knowing to take that leap of faith and everything's going to turn out just fine. They do this in Europe every day, where children are exposed to 2 or 3 languages all of the time and they're fine. Right? And then these two are together, remaining consistent and structured, right? And using one language, one parent theory where possible. So that slides under that structure approach. So as a household, let's say if you do have one parent that speaks one language, let's say it be English, and another parent that speaks Tagalog, as an example. For your child, when the parent keeps informed, so to speak, so speaking only English, speaking only Tagalog, it helps actually the child categorize with regards to executive function skills. It's almost as though you're sort of giving them a little bit of a nudge to create those categories in their head. And if it's not one language, one parent, it could be one place, one language. So for example, there are schools that have one teacher that speaks the target language and another teacher that speaks the native language to that particular country. So trying to create that consistency and structure where possible, because it is important for just giving them that boost. And then if you decide that it's not something that's at the home level, but that is at the school level, you know, when you are going around and visiting various places, trying to gain insight as to what their structure is. You know, how often, what's the frequency of the language? Do they have a setup where it's one teacher speaking the target language, another teacher speaking the native language? Or is it that they're pulling children out maybe 30 minutes a week? When you understand what their structure is, it lets you know what their values are towards, specifically with regards to language and how they prioritize language. That's it with regards to the presentation piece of it. But before we go, I wanted to open the floor for any questions that you might have.
So I was wondering, our nanny is German. Do you think it would be a good idea for us to ask our nanny to speak to our kids in German?
Absolutely. That's, as I had mentioned before, an opportunity that you can certainly use for your child's sake. You know, what's important to understand is that regardless of what the language is, it could be German, it could be Italian, it could be even a dialect that may even be dying, okay? And the reason why I say that is because ultimately the end goal is that you're building reserves in your child's brain. And so if you see that opportunity and you know that your nanny would be willing to speak to your child in that language every single day for however many hours, I would say, and I would highly encourage that you pursue that.
I speak Spanish to my daughter at home, but she will answer me back in English now that she's learning that in school. Should I be concerned about that? What should I do?
I would say stay the course. Keep speaking to her in Spanish. Don't let it bother you, at least in front of her, that she's responding to you in English. She is certainly absorbing it, and by you speaking to her continuously in Spanish, it's a form of her active participation because she has to actively listen to you in order to know what to say back to you. What I recommend to families sometimes that that have this situation where their child may not respond in the language that the parent is speaking to him or her in, is wait, and then as they get older, send them to a really fun country that speaks the language because it's there. They just need to have that, again, almost like a little push to use it, but it's certainly in the brain.
Is it possible for my child to learn a language through the television or through singing songs from media sources?
It is. But there's a greater chance for them to learn how to speak the language from human to human interaction. So there have been a number of studies on this, not just in learning a second language, but in language acquisition in general. Children need to see the mouth working. They need to visually see you almost in 3D for them to not only make sense of the sound from, I guess, a visual standpoint. I know that sounds odd because it's not visual, but they need that piece in order for them to then make the sounds themselves. Thank you all so much for being here with me this evening. I really appreciate your questions, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully next time. Thank you.
Thank you.